before I talk in depth about the lessons that the church can learn from education reform, I want to tell you about one of my teachers from last year. Her name is Denise, and those are her students from room 112. The reason Denise's classroom is a little bit smaller than most classrooms is she teaches students with special needs. I was a special education teacher in Los Angeles, and all of the teachers that I support in Chicago support students with special needs. This is her class. Denise teaches at Hughes Elementary. There's a lot of challenges that Denise faces at Hughes Elementary. 98% of her students qualify for free lunch. Her students are on average about 3 grade levels behind in their academic performance. 60% of her students won't graduate from high school if current trends continue. And the 40 who do graduate will perform at roughly the 8th grade and 7th grade levels for English and math. 2% of those students will then matriculate to college and get a degree. So serious challenge. I don't probably need to mention too that there's a lot of cultural challenges in that Denise's students are very difficult in terms of behavior management. A lot of them don't feel like school is very important, or they've gone to school, they know that school is important, but they just don't have the skills needed to be successful. You can imagine as a new teacher, Denise going into this environment faced a lot of challenges. And in my first 6 meetings with her, she cried in each meeting. 6 meetings of crying. This girl could cry. The reason I actually laugh about that now is she ended up doing extremely well. She worked very, very, very hard. And she recognized that in order to be an effective teacher, she needed to be an effective leader. And that took knowing exactly what the destination was for her students. For most of her 3rd graders, it meant making the transition from learning to read to being able to read to learn, so that in 4th grade you start reading text to apprehend new information. In 3rd grade you're learning the mechanisms of reading so that you're able to do that in 4th grade. And for many of our students that are functioning at about a 1st grade level, if they don't make that jump, when they get to 4th grade, they're going to be behind and the years will just kind of fly by them. And they're probably going to be those that are not going to finish high school. So Denise recognized in order for her students to have the opportunities and life choices that she had, she needed to dramatically change their academic progress over the course of the year. So she worked really, really hard in investing them and their students. She planned. She developed this elaborate token economy in her class where when students did things, they won class points. It was a really exciting process, but it was really, really hard. Denise worked extremely hard. On this graph, you can see the rate of progress at the end of the year. So the red line is Denise's class. This is math and reading growth on 2 different standardized assessments. The average national growth, obviously, is about 1 year of growth per each grade spent in school. Hughes Elementary, the school that Denise teaches at, normally has a growth rate of 0.35 years of growth. So this is about 5 times the rate of growth. And actually, Denise, despite the challenges she faces at the beginning of the year, by the end of the year, her class averaged growth that was twice as much as any other teacher at her school. And it's not because Denise was some wonder worker. It was that she worked really, really hard. She had exceptional leadership skills as she started, and she was just intent on helping every one of her students, and she knew that they could do it. In case you worry that Denise was sort of a standardized test, focused teacher, and that was all she did, I wanted to show you this rubric, which actually doesn't capture all of it, but it shows some of the other qualitative aspects of her students that she wanted to develop as well. So there was work ethic, community, voice and perception, organization, resourcefulness. And all of these rubric strands were something she would have a meeting with each student at the beginning of the month, and they would talk through, what are the behaviors that I'm seeing right now? What do I see in terms of your voice and perception? What do I see in terms of your organization in class? Here's what I want you to do this month. And they would set a goal for each month for each student as the sort of progress she wanted to see, so that by the end of the year, they had a dramatically different view of school, view of themselves in school, and more of the soft skills that are required to be successful in high school and college. Really, really neat. I could tell you about more people like Denise. I had one teacher named Nicole. 100% of Nicole's students went on to higher education, even though at her school only 40% of students. This despite the fact that all of those students have IEPs, or special education students. So it's really, really exciting to see what's happening in Chicago. The same thing is happening in Teach for America all across the regions. There's about 35 regions right now. The thing that I get to, though, is as much as I care about urban education in America and the need for that, I care much more about the church. And I think as a church, we recognize the benefit of public education. We want all people to read. We are people that are concerned and centered around a book. That's pretty difficult to read.
And so we care a lot about everyone having access to a great education, but we care even more as people around that book about the quality and vitality of the church. This is the way I kind of think about that. All of these different spheres of vocation are critically important, and all of them have unique ways of living out the difference between a sort of world-centered view of things and a Christ-centered view of things. And I view the church as a sort of hub around all of these revolving. It doesn't mean that it's any higher. It's not like a sort of special vocation that only certain people can do. But it's sort of the like traffic cop of these different vocations finding meaning and building up the church and helping people see what the church ought to be and God's sort of incarnation of his kingdom on the earth. It's also an important place in that the church is the place where Christians sort of find community and partnership and a vision for what their life is important and what it needs to be. So to me, the church is a really central player, and it's really important that we have just as strong of leadership as the church as we have people like Denise in our most needy public schools. I also view education in the church as having a really intersection, in that more than maybe some vocations, education and the church can learn from one another. There's a lot of similarities in that the progress of a church and the progress of a school is often sort of intangible, inward skills. The aptitude of a leader in those settings is a little bit harder to discern. It's not like you're just maximizing profit or building more buildings or something like that. It's heart work, it's community work, it's slow going. Sometimes there's gains that you don't see for a long time. The success of a church and a school cannot just easily be multiplied across different settings. You don't just open a new church like you open a new Chipotle. It takes understanding of the neighborhood, the needs of the people there. And so it's hard. You can't just sort of like multiply like you might in other contexts. There's also mediocre training mechanisms. I think a lot of people, even the people that run seminaries, recognize that it's really hard to teach the skills that it takes to be a strong pastor. A lot of education programs are facing the same struggle right now. What do we need to do for our teachers to really be really effective when we finish? There's inequitable distribution of strong leadership. So we have some churches that have incredible leadership, but there's whole swaths of neighborhoods in Chicago where my wife and I live. There's some really strong churches in certain neighborhoods, and then in other areas there's not a lot of churches, or the leadership of those churches isn't very trained. Finally, there's this feeling in both education and ministry that it's a sort of gift, that you're born with it, that it's kind of like not something you can learn or teach. It's sort of this magic that comes out of you when you work with a student. And unlike other vocations, there's a sense that you can learn those, you can teach those, you slowly develop. For ministry and education, we kind of sometimes have this feeling like some people have it and some people don't, and we're not sure why. That makes it challenging to develop the next generations of leaders if you feel like there's not a lot of agency we have in determining how good they are. I'm going to pull out 3 big lessons that I see the church and the way we think about church that we can learn from education reform, specifically Teach for America. So I'm going to outline the problem that education faces, the way that Teach for America has worked to address that problem, and then some parallels that we can learn in a church setting. So the first lesson is talent matters. Talent is the most important thing. So the problem in education, 23% of teachers are from the top third of college students that are starting. So what that means is most of them come from the sort of bottom 2/3. And this becomes even more problematic in low-income schools, where only 14% of the teachers are from the top third of students going to college. This shows itself in Chicago, where I work, where the average ACT score of a teacher in Chicago is a 19. To give you context, the average score at Biola is a 24, at UCLA it's 28, at Cal State Fullerton it's about 22. So just the quality of the people walking in and their proficiency in the academic skills that they're teaching is just not as high as it needs to be. The other problem is even that measure, like an ACT score, how good an indicator of that is how good of a teacher you are. The problem, though, is there's not a control for things like leadership or communication skills or ambitious goals for students. It's not as though education programs are targeting those skills at the expense of ACT. It's ACT, and that's about it. So Teach for America's response was not to create a new curriculum or to improve the standardized testing mechanisms or to create a parent advocacy group that helps people empowered for campaigning for stronger schools. What they did was they said, we need to get a lot more bright people into our nation's underperforming schools. So they created a national teaching corps, started 20 years ago. Each year, right now, there's about 5,000 new teachers. Their average GPA is 3.6, 87% of significant leadership positions. 160 applicants are student body presidents. 18% of Yale applies, 14% of Harvard, 25% of Spelman. The interesting thing here, too, is that these are not the stats that Teach for America is working toward. What they're working for are teacher competencies. And the way that they do this is they look for their most successful teachers, and they say, what were the qualities that they had? What are the proxies that we can look at in a new application to suggest they have these capacities? How do we get more of them? So the key importance here was we just have to get the best people in the classroom. I want to note two things also, is that you can imagine that someone going into this would think it's really, really difficult to have these sort of people coming in that the average person coming in is just not at the same level of caliber. How do we get these new people in? That will go into point 2 a little bit, but I think it's just interesting how laser-like focus on finding the best people and bringing them into the classroom. I think the parallels that this has for the church, there's a similar low standard for starting seminary. There was an Auburn ministry poll that was done of all MDiv programs, and they found that only about half of these people actually plan on serving local congregations. I think megachurches are good evidence of the fact that there's lack of strong parish churches. So I don't think people decide that they want to drive a long way to go to a really large church. There's a lack of great options nearby, and that says, all right, we want to go to a strong church. The closest really strong church is this one 30 minutes away. There's not very bad traffic on Sunday, so we'll go. I think if there were strong pastors in every neighborhood church, people would have more incentive to stay at home. Finally, I think the biggest indicator of this is most of our brightest young Christian men don't want to become pastors. A few do, but fewer and fewer every year. When I think about the bright students of Westmont and Wheaton and Biola and APU and Gordon, the highest graduates want to go into business and law and medicine and urban planning and professions in media and art and design. A lot of them don't decide that they want to become ministers, and I think that's a huge problem. I think the lesson that we need to learn is that that's the problem that we need to be most obsessed with. It's not going to be having certain teaching sermons or programming or new buildings or a capital funds campaign. We need to attract the best people to lead the churches. They'll make the decisions that are best for those local congregations in the different contexts they find themselves in. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that the criteria that we have for strong leadership of a church match that of the incoming applicant. So right now, if you are interested, that's the sort of primary gate. So if you're interested, you can do it. There are very few filters that say, no, you don't have the requisite skills. At the same time, we need people that love the church, that care for the church's health, and that have a zeal for doing the work of the church and see the potential and the mission of each church. Finally, we need to continue the development of pastors just the way that we need to continue the development of teachers. Just because they finish seminary doesn't mean they're sort of ready for everything. And there needs to be a continued professional development and sort of hierarchy for a church leader, just as there needs to be for doctors and lawyers and other professions. The next lesson that I think the church can learn from Teach for America and education reform, recruitment is just so important. The problem in education is that if you are at Harvard or Yale, Princeton, large banks, investment firms, and consulting groups are aggressively recruiting you when you're a freshman, sophomore, and junior. They're there. They want to talk to you. They want to talk about the exciting skills that you'll develop. It's really exciting work. Education is sort of respected, but it's not considered really difficult, exciting, important work. It's nice for someone else to do, but a lot of the brightest students don't really want to do that. So Teach for America's response is they aggressively recruit on 103 campuses. They connect teaching to social justice, so it feels like something that's incredibly important and meaningful and worthwhile. They also showcase the impact of alumni, so that people like Michelle Rhee and Cammie Anderson and John White, who lead school districts in New Orleans and Newark and Washington, D.C., they're shown for the tremendous impact that they have. Finally, there's a culture of excellence. When you aren't letting 89% of the people that apply to do this, there's this sense that it's very difficult work, that the standards are very high, that you need to do it well because kids' futures depend on it. And that creates a culture that's attractive to someone who's high performing. I think the lessons that the church can learn, we're also sort of out-recruited. There's a similar respect for ministry, but not a sense that it's difficult, exciting, or rewarding work. And then there's this general perception that God needs to explicitly call ministers in a way that he doesn't explicitly call engineers and social workers and plumbers. And I think that's actually not true. First, I think we need to show that God really cares about the church. And young people need to grow up feeling like church work is very difficult, but it's respected and it's hard. And the church is the place where other vocations find their meaning and connect with one another. I think we also need to go and target these bright young men, if you're a complementarian, bright young men and women, at Wheaton and Gordon and say, hey, I'm not saying you should become a pastor, but I want you to think really carefully about whether that's maybe the right thing for you. I have a friend who goes to an Anglican church, and he expressed no interest in going into ministry. And the vicar goes to him and says, I want to spend the next year with you. I'm going to mentor you, and we're going to discern if the Spirit is calling you into the priesthood. This person had not had any interest. He hadn't acted like he wanted to do that. In the evangelical church, though, we're a little squeamish with that. We're not really used to doing that, and I think that's preventing a lot of talented people from saying, maybe I should go to seminary because I'd like to do this. I have the right skill set for it. I think finally, we also need to showcase the exciting work that churches are doing, not just mega churches. So there's neat churches that are partnering in low-income areas with community collaborations. It's really cool work, but a lot of people don't know about it. We need to showcase the exciting, kind of difficult, innovative things that pastors are doing, so people think of that as a role that's exciting and difficult and going to use their gifts and really push them. Last lesson is metrics matter. So in education, there's a perception that it's really hard to tell who's a good teacher. There's been polarizing debates on standardized tests, and the suspicion that sort of data-drivenness and looking at Excel docs is sort of too corporate. That's come at the expense of, I think, two things. First, data is really important. So as human beings, we're going to count something. Too often in low-income schools, they're counting attendance because that's what funding depends on. The second thing that it does is it delegitimizes education as a vocation apart from other vocations. So where does most of the money come from? The business community. The business community wants accountability in nonprofits. And if we shun any sort of metrics, then we make ourselves less respected and less credible in the eyes of the people that are giving out the most money. So Teach for America's response has been to embrace the good things of business. So there's strong partnerships with consulting firms like McKinsey, and also saying like, data is one part of what we do here. So we want to develop strong students who are learners and love the world and love their teacher and care for one another. We also want them to get an ACT score that will get them into college so they can be the first person in their generation to go to college from their family. There's also been a move to create better tests. So if standardized tests aren't a great way of measuring, fine. Let's find some other way of measuring. Maybe it's oral conversation. Maybe it's a discussion. Maybe it's writing prompts. But we need to have something so that we know which of our teachers are most effective, which of our schools are most effective, which of the teaching practices that we're teaching new teachers are most effective. The best way to do that is to look at data samples over large sets. I think the way that the church can learn from this is we count things. We just usually only count two things, the attendance of the church and the budget of the church. And I think we need to push our leadership and ourselves to sort of think more thoughtfully about what is it that we want to count? What do we really care about? And what are the best proxies of that? Because if we don't decide what we count, we'll just sort of count what everyone counts. I think that we could count things like the percentage of the congregation that serve in the church or serve in other ministry settings, maybe the percentage of visitors that feel welcomed, maybe the number of missionaries sent each year, or the evidence of growth in spiritual disciplines. I think a lot of good work is actually being done here in a lot of churches right now, but we need to sort of like embrace it and say, there are good lessons to be learned from different vocations. Let's apply them to church work and have a very holistic view of what success looks like in the church. I think I've got no more time, so I won't have any time for questions, but I'd love to talk to you afterward, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear this important topic. Thanks.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.